I'm not going to wait anymore. I'm going to share my screen and kick off tonight. So my name is CAROLYN. You don't see me. I'm not the only host tonight because I am assisted by Marie Saksik. So here are tonight's slide. I think if you joined, it's because you noticed we were doing something quite unique on the Paris, in the Paris WiMLDS chapter. And tonight's meetup is dedicated to the International Day Against Homophobia, Transphobia and Biphobia. So we're very happy to see you online. Usually we have a cocktail at the end, we see each other, we see our smiles, but tonight we're just going to hear each other and to write to each other. So if you have never attended a WiMLDS meetup, it's important for you to know what WiMLDS is all about. We are a global organization and we aim at supporting and promoting women and gender minorities who are practicing, studying, or are interested in machine learning and data science. Globally, we are a community of more than 52,000 members. We have currently 80, I know it's 85 because one of them is in Mongolia and it's using Facebook and not Meetup. So we have 85 chapters and we are present in 34 countries. We have a code of conduct. I'm going to sum it up. Basically, we want to provide a harassment-free experience for everyone. We are enjoying, sharing knowledge in a peaceful way, in a respectful manner. So the deal is usually to be kind to each other, to ask questions in a positive way. And tonight is not going to be an exception, but because we are online, we're just going to make sure that we use smileys and emojis in order to better understand each other's feelings. We're going to be muted. So right now I am the only one to be able to speak, but soon I'm going to shut up. I muted everyone, but I will unmute everyone for the Q&A part. But please use the chat section in order to ask your question, and then the speakers will be able to answer your question. So use the chat extensively, and if you have any other question, please contact Marie or myself privately on the chat. You can follow WiMLDS Paris online via different tools. We are very active on Twitter. Even the global account is amazing if you want to find content about machine learning and data science. We are present on Instagram, Slack, LinkedIn. We recently created a global calendar on which you can find all the meetups of the WiMLDS community. So not just in Paris, because of the COVID situation, a lot of meetups are happening online right now. And if you want to reach out to us, you can contact us to paris@wimlds.org. Usually when we kick off a meeting, we like to share news about the community. We already did it 2 weeks ago, but we think it's important. The Women in Science Award is happening soon, and the applications are valid until the 31st of May. So if you work in mathematics, physical science, or computer science, we strongly encourage you to send an application because it gives you finance and it gives you visibility on a global scale. Tonight, we are going to focus on what the International Day Against Homophobia, Transphobia and Biphobia is. It's a day that has been created in 2004 in order to draw the attention towards lesbians, gays, bisexuals, transgenders, intersex people, and all the people that have diverse sexual orientations, gender identities. And it's important. They selected the day of May the 17th. So why we did it tonight is because it's happening on a Sunday this year. So we wanted you to do it prior to Sunday. And this day is quite special because in 1990, the World Health Organization decided to declassify homosexuality as a mental disorder. So this is why this day is happening every year on May the 17th. At Paris WiMLDS, we want everyone to feel welcome and included. And if we dedicated this meetup to the LGBTQ+ community, it's because we know when you're part of an invisible minority, you might struggle. And you're not the only one. We are a support group. Some of us are part of the LGBTQ+ community, and it's important that you feel that you can reach out to us if you have any issue or if you want to share a success on the contrary. And you know, being an LGBTQ person at work is not always easy. For instance, in your personal life in 37 countries, same-sex marriages are illegal. So there's still some work to do. And we prepared some figures because we wanted you to learn also more about the LGBTQ+ community. These figures come from a study between the Boston Consulting Group and the gay magazine called Têtu. It's a French one. And the data is fascinating. 80% of the LGBTQ+ employees are ready to come out at work, but only 1 person out of 2 did. So you see, there is a contrast. 35% of the LGBTQ+ employees believe being out at work could damage their career. And I know that tonight we are lucky to have 2 speakers that are out at work. And so we need also to have good examples. It's possible to be out at work and to be successful. 46% of the LGBTQ+ employees would lie to their manager about their sexual orientation during an informal discussion. So of course, these data are really related to the French people, but it's interesting. 13% of the LGBTQ+ employees would accept unwillingly to work in a country where LGBTQ+ rights are not respected. And I also wanted to focus on non-binary, transgender, and bisexual people because they are not willing to come out at work, or they're not really willing in the same way as lesbian and gays. So it's important, and cis people. So we will share these data later on because it's interesting to share it with the biggest number of people. But I'm going to go on. Here you have figures about data in Europe, and French people appear to be the least at ease with talking about their sexual orientation during an informal discussion at work. It seems to be okayer in Spain. It seems to be more doable in countries such as the UK, the Netherlands, and the US and Canada, for instance. Here in France, it's important. The LGBTQ+ community believes being out at work is not necessarily linked to be a strength. So that being said, if tonight's meetup is dedicated to the LGBTQ+ community, is again because we want to prove that you can be out at work and successful and happy. If you are okay or not to be out at work, you can look for support groups in STEM. For instance, WiMLDS is more than LGBTQ+ friendly. You can also check the work of Queer in AI. You can ask tonight to Paola, who's going to speak soon, about Queer.js for the JavaScript technologies. In France, you can check the work done by LGBT Tech. They are present only on Facebook. You can also check LGBT Talents. And you have also, I didn't put it, but a work done by L'Autre Cercle. L'Autre Cercle is not linked to STEM, it's linked to all the different kind of companies. So tonight, we are going to have the pleasure to listen to Paola Ducolin about coding for humans. She's a staff engineer at Dashlane. Then we will listen to Charles Tanguy, who's a data scientist at JEDA Bootcamp. And Charles is a gem. He teaches data science and is going to teach us more about that. And tonight, if you want, you can tweet in parallel on Twitter using our account, WiMLDS_Paris. You can also use those two hashtags, WiMLDS or WiMLDS online. So now I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going also to mute myself, and I'm going to ask Paola to share her slides, and I'm going to unmute you.
Okay. And I still don't see the chat. So I don't know if you can see me and hear me. Oh.
We can hear you, Paola.
Thank you.
And we see your slides.
Okay, thank you. Sorry for the small minute of setup. So thank you very much. I'm very honored and moved for this invitation. I want to thank you, Women in Machine Learning Data Science. I don't work in machine learning and neither in data science. I'm a programmer, but I really love the work that Women in Machine Learning and Data Science does for the community and for women in STEM. So I'm going to talk about the importance of empathy and emotional intelligence in coding, how it can improve your work, how it can improve eventually your life, believe me. But first, let me introduce myself. So I'm Paola Ducolin, as CAROLYN said. I'm a staff engineer at Dashlane. I'm a co-organizer in Ladies of Code Paris. I'm an organizer of Paris Queer.js, and I've been in software development for more than 10 years. And I've been working with legacy code for more than 8 years. And this is where this talk is coming from the experience that I have with legacy code, with a bad experience, and with the bad experience of my code that became legacy code, and where that was hard to work with for others and for myself in the first place. So I'm gonna talk a bit about Queer.js because I think you might be interested. So Queer.js, it's not really about just JavaScript. It's a meetup that started from this tweet by Sarah Vieira with an international speaker that realized how few queer speakers there are in the tech community. That is mainly men, white men, of course, as we know. So she started this idea of having a one-shot meetup in Berlin, where she's based. And this was in June 2019. Sorry, it's all in Italian because my Twitter is in Italian, of course. And from this tweet, in like 6 months, all these meetups were organized all around the world. We had one in Paris in December, Lisbon, Toronto, New York, Munich, London, Barcelona, and there was supposed to be one happening in Tokyo that was postponed because of COVID. But on Saturday, we're very proud of having our first online meetup. It's not at 5 Paris time, it's gonna be at 6 Paris time. It's at 4 UTC time that I found that it's not London time, but it's Iceland time. Very funny story. And you can follow it on twitch.tv/queerjs. We're gonna have a lot of French speakers. We're gonna have 4 French speakers, and we're gonna have the analytical. I'm thrilled about that. So going back to my talk, I wanna talk about coding for humans, but I'm gonna do one more digression before. That is designing for humans and product designing for humans. That uses what is called user experience. You might be familiar with it. By Wikipedia is the process that the user has to approaching a new product, and it's particularly centered on the easy and on the pleasure of using a product that the user finds. And it's aimed to reduce the friction so that the user becomes familiar with the product in the shortest time, so that he uses more the product and he buys more. And one example is the washing machine. I think many of us are familiar with it. And you might have noticed that all washing machines still come with a knob, even if they are completely digital nowadays. So they might have only one touch screen or only buttons. And while talking with a washing machine producer back in my Italian days, I found that they still use the knob because people are familiar with the knob, and they try to do washing machine with buttons, and people were not familiar, and the user experience was bad, was crappy, and so they stick to the mechanical knob. And the other example is my favorite lamp. It's an Italian design. It's the Arco by Floss that was designed by Fratelli Castiglioni in early 60s. You might have seen it. If you don't know it, you might have seen it, or you will notice it in any movie that is set in the 60s or 70s. And the peculiarity of this lamp, beside the fact that it's very beautiful, but this is my opinion, is the base. It has a marble base that weighs 65 kilos, and that is pretty heavy to transport. And there is a hole in this base, and you might think that it's just for design, so for the sake of it, and no. It is meant to pass a broomstick in the middle of it so that two people can transport it easily. So again, the user at the center of the design, and the user experience at the center of the design. You can find more of these funny facts in this book that I love, the design of everyday things, that tells you what works and what doesn't work, and the study that there is behind all the objects that we use normally every day. So this said, all this process has in common the use of empathy and the study of how people will use the product. So my question is, what if we use the same process for code? And the question that I'm going to ask you about is, who are the first user of a code base? Before it's compiled, before it's transpiled, before it's bundled? Well, the users are other programmers. And why don't we use empathy to improve the developer experience, so the user experience of other programmers and of ourselves too? Because I don't know about you, but myself, I have a very bad memory, and if I come back to some code that I worked on 6 months ago, I don't remember anything. I'm totally unfamiliar with it. By the way, this photo is by Queen Tech Photos. If you look for queer stock photos, this is awesome. And I did this all just to put this photo. So, and again, what if we apply empathy to reduce the friction to our code base so that we keep the familiarity with our code base and we can easy the onboarding of newcomers, of new colleagues, and we can be also more inclusive with our colleagues. So this is about my experience with legacy code and why I started thinking about using empathy, and I started thinking about how to improve the process. So the first feeling is lost and deceivement and anger and like desperation and then sadness. And since I don't want to be sad, I want to be happy in my life, and I spend 8-10 hours a day coding, I don't want to be like this. So another important point is that we spend most of our coding life reading instead of writing. We can think that we spend a lot of time, like all our training, all the computer science trainings are about writing code, and less time is spent about reading. So, and in our working life, we spend most of the time reading, trying to understand what the code is about, and then we write new features, or we write and fix bugs. And I had the chance in my experience twice in my life to start from scratch. And the second time I did it, it was recently, it was 2 years ago at Dashlane. And so I had this huge responsibility. I was the tech lead of a project starting from scratch, from zero. And I didn't want others to feel angry about my code, or to feel desperate, or to feel lost about my code base. So with my colleagues, we thought that all code becomes legacy code eventually. So we are part of it. We don't be judgmental when you see legacy code, because your code is gonna do the same end eventually. And so we trained ourselves on being more empathic when writing code. And I ended up with 2 main areas of focus. One is writing readable code, and the other one is writing human documentation. And today I'm gonna talk about this. So first, let's go with readable code. Again, remember that we spend more time reading than writing code. So the first rule that we applied is use semantically meaning names. So I'm gonna go with some code examples. I have this is all in JavaScript because I recently moved to JavaScript. In the original talk, it was in C#, so it applies to most of the languages. And I have a rectangle, okay? And the rectangle constructor takes 2 arguments, 2 variables, W and H, and then there is a function that is calc_a that multiplies the 2 variables. So we can understand, because we are familiar with the rectangle, that W and H stand for width and height, and calc_a is probably the surface calculation, the area. But imagine if it was not a rectangle, it was a more complex object that we are not familiar with. So why don't we write width and height explicitly and calculate area more explicitly? Because remember, we write once and then we read it 9 times. So even if we spend a bit more time writing it, we're gonna save more time when we read it eventually. And another example, this is a real example. It's from code that I reviewed a couple of weeks ago. And so we have a constant variable letters that is clearly all the letters of the alphabet kept from a QWERTY keyboard, apparently. And then we have a variable that is chars that takes letters and that adds numbers and symbols. So if I think about chars, and I don't see, I don't have access to the declaration of this variable, I'm not sure what chars is. Personally, I will think about letters, still letters. And so why don't calling it letters, digits, and symbols? Yeah, it's longer, but it fits a screen and it's more explicit and it takes a less effort while reading it. The second tip is prevent reading inner code. That uses the semantically meaning names as one of the tools. So this is another example. We have the rectangle and we have the function that is called increase size. And increase size takes an argument, a double, a float. And if we don't see the function, so here we are biased because we have it, but if we don't see the function, we think that increase size will increase the size. So if we multiply by 0.3, we're gonna have the dimensions that are gonna increase. And no, because actually if you're gonna see the code, width and height are multiplied by the double factor. So if the factor is less than 1, we're gonna reduce the size. So how can we improve this code? We can call it scale width and height by factor. And this is more explicitly saying that it will depend on the factor if we're gonna increase or decrease the size. By the way, sorry, I forgot to say that all the examples are on my GitHub and you can find it through the bit.ly link. Another tip for avoiding inner code, reading inner code, is comment. In books about clean code, there's few about writing comment, because the main idea is that if you write meaningful names, then you don't need comments because you are the coolest guy and you use the coolest names, but it's not always possible. So don't be afraid. You can use comments. They are safe. They will help you. Especially I use them if I find something on Stack Overflow, because sometimes, yeah, I copy paste from Stack Overflow and I usually put the link to the Stack Overflow that I copy pasted from, so that other users, so other developers, can go and see, okay, this is a hack because she found it there, and they can find the reason why. Or if there is a bug in an API, for example, that requires a hack in the code, that is useful to put the link to the bug, or to put the link to the reason why we use some code that is not natural or not explicit. So going on, the next tips are do one thing and minimize function length. And here I have a very long function, still with a rectangle. It's in 2 columns. So we have a function that adjusts a rectangle. So it takes a rectangle that has width and height properties, and it's gonna add some properties to the rectangle, and it's gonna set these properties. So it's gonna set the size, the error, and its square. So it begins with, if width is higher than 10,000, then size is large, and if height is less than 100, it has a error. I don't know why. And if width and height equals, then it is a square. Guess what? And all of this is very hard to read. Why? Because it touches parties, like it changes properties in different parts of the functions. So what if we reorganize this function? What if we refactor it and try to simplify, to make it more readable? The first step is create a test. And last time I did this talk, I said that I hate tests, so I'm trying to improve on that. And this is a library for JavaScript for property-based testing. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It will generate a random test. The I think the default is 100 test with random integers, in this case, to create random rectangles. And then what I do is copy my function, so the previous function, I copy, I call it new, and I check that the result of adjust, so the previous version and the new version, have the same output, so that I know that I'm not breaking anything during the test. The second thing that I do is taking all the part of the function that touch the same properties. So for example, I start with size. So I take the default one and then I move them to a adjust size function. And I run it and I know that I'm not breaking anything because I have my test. The second is has error. Okay, I underline all the parts that are touching has error and I copy them to adjust has error. And eventually I do the same with e square, and tada, I have my function refactored and it's much readable. And if the subfunction names are not that easy to find, you can still use comments, remember. So another tip is use top-down narrative. And disclaimer, this cannot be done in all languages. For example, Python or C, they require a function to be defined before being able to use it. So you cannot do it every time in every language, but in JavaScript you can. So the idea is that when we read books, when we read articles, we don't read them from the bottom to the top, we read them top down. So why not writing code so that it is readable top down? What does it mean is that first we should write the function that we call from the outside and then write the inner functions. And we usually do the opposite. So this is the standard example. We usually have, imagine that the rectangle is a way bigger function, bigger class, bigger file. And we have on top, we have the private functions. So scale width by factor and scale 8 by factor. And then we have a function that we call from the outside, so a public function that is scale with an 8 by factor. And if we read that top down, we first read scale width by factor and scale 8 by factor, and we're not interested in it because we don't use it outside. And then we jump at scale with an 8 by factor, and by the time we reach that, we forgot about the implementation of the inner functions. So the better way to do that is to first write the public function and right away write the calling, the function that are called inside, so the sub-functions, and group them together so that everything is there, everything is clear, and we read it top down. And last tips are review with a team and use refactoring tools. So review with a team, sensibilize your team during pull request review. If you do pull request review, try to sensibilize the team on these topics. By the way, this topic is not new, is maybe quite old, but still we see code that is unreadable, that is complex, that takes pages and pages, like of line and line of code. So sensibilize your team, and especially the newcomers, because as far as I know, at the university, we still don't sensibilize people to readability. And help yourself with refactoring tools for renaming and for moving code around. If you want to know more about clean code, this is considered the Bible of clean code. Robert C. Martin, also known as Uncle Bob. I never read it. It's like in my backlog. I might read it. But yeah, if you're curious about it, and in this book, Robert Martin says that you shouldn't write comments, and I don't agree with that, but by the way. And another talk that I strongly suggest is this talk from Romeo Moura about reading code with empathy. And this is very important because when you read code, when you read legacy code, as we saw, you might feel anger and sad, and you might become judgmental towards people that wrote your code. You might blame them, as Git says, and maybe to find out that line of ugly code were coming from you. So try not to judge others and try to use empathy and put in the shoes of the developer that was maybe just out of college or that maybe just didn't know how to do things. We all learn. No one was born already with all the knowledge of coding. So let's move on to human documentation, and I'm gonna drink a bit. So about writing human documentation, documentation is probably the part of coding that is more underestimated, and that is very important, that I found really important. And luckily people are becoming more and more sensible about it, because they found out that if you write proper documentation, onboarding people and have onboarding contributors becomes more easy. And the way to approach documentation should be to use every project as an open source project, even if it's private, even if it's not open source. You should have an open source approach, so that the idea is to have the most of the contributors to your source code. So about this topic, I strongly recommend this amazing talk by CAROLYN STRANSKY, that, by the way, was one of the organizers of Queer.js, about humanizing documentation, where she said that, yeah, people don't mind reading documentation because the idea is, yeah, but nobody is gonna read it. Well, they read it if the documentation is well done, if it's useful. So first tip is use inclusive and clear language. If you want to include people, you should have inclusive language. And these tips come from CAROLYN talk, so you can find them there, but I'm gonna talk about them also here. So the first tool that you can use to ensure inclusive language is Alex.js. You can reach it by the link. And this is command line based tool and also a web app tool. So you can use it even for your articles, for example, and you can run it on your code base, and it will look for all the MD, all the markdown files. So the code, the language that is used for documentation, and it will flag all the words that are insensitive or aggressive or not inclusive. For example, it will flag all the he, and it will suggest to you they or it. It will flag all the easily and trivial that I like. They make me mad, because if I find something easy, trivial, and I cannot do it, I feel stupid, and I'm not, and I don't want to feel stupid. So please try this tool. We use it, we tested it in some of our code bases, and we flagged some really nice errors. So it's quite funny to use. The second tool is WriteCode. It's quite similar, and it's only command line. So it's based on GitHub. You can clone it and use it. And to test it, I took three random tweets by Donald Trump. This is not my thinking, this is Donald Trump thinking. And I tested it just for fun, and guess what? It found some pretty aggressive language. I could find worse. But yeah, maybe he could try this. And the third is Hemingway app. I don't know if you know it. Quite amazing. It's only web-based, and you can copy-paste your articles or your text there, and it will flag, it will give you a grade of readability, and it will flag sentences that are too complex, that need points, or that are too many adverbs. Pretty amazing. And you can find it Hemingway app. Okay, so you ensure inclusivity in your documentation. Now you need to have the documentation reachable and visible to the users, so to other developers. And this is particularly important. In my experience, at Dashlane, we historically use Confluence for documentation, and I personally hate it because the search tool in Confluence is just broken. I cannot find anything. And so when you cannot find something, the result is that you probably will end up writing another documentation about the same topic. And then the third person arrives and you find two documents that say not the same thing. And so you are lost again. And so about this, there is this very good recent article by Kyle Gill that used this visual metaphor of roads to navigate documentation. And the idea is to have a highway to reach the part of the code that are the more useful, and then side roads if you want to know details. And Kyle Gill is a contributor of Gatsby, that is a web framework that is very used and very loved. And guess what? The feature why it is mostly loved is documentation. So yeah, people are sensible to documentation, actually, even in tech. So we used this approach for an open source project. You can find it at WiMLDS on GitHub. This is our web design system. It's a work in progress. And me and my team worked on it. And we mostly, the most of the work that we did in 1 quarter is about documentation. So first we define how things were supposed to be done, and we improve the process, and then we improve the documentation about it. So we have one contributing file where you can find all the setup that you need to do. So it's step by step, all the setup that you need to do to run the project. And then we have step-by-step guides to add components to the library, where you have code snippets that you can copy-paste and modify for your usage. And by doing this, so it was the 1st quarter of this year, we ended up in March, and we increased by 4 times the commits. This is the number of commits, and we passed from 4 contributors to 20 contributors in few months. And last tip is keep it up to date. And this is why I don't like using Confluence for documentation. I prefer using Markdown inside repository. And this will give more visibility to the update step, because when you change the code, you will be kind of forced, because it's there. You cannot. It's there. You see it. If you don't update it, you see it. And if you want to be sure that people are sensible to and remind them about documentation, you can use templates. This article is about GitHub templates, but there are templates for other repository like GitLab. So you can use a template where you enforce where you remember each user, when the user will open a pull request, he will be asked, did you remember to update the documentation? So this was all for me. Thank you very much for listening. I hope I moved something in you. This topic is something that I learned quite recently. I've been developing for 11 years and I've been sensibilized about it in the last 3 years. So I hope more of you will be moved by this. Thank you.
Thank you, Paola. It was really, really cool. If you have any question, please feel free to write your question in the chat section. While you do so, Paola, I just tweeted Analytica and she just retweeted it.
She's awesome.
Yeah. So I don't see any question yet in the chat part. I'm just waiting a little bit, and don't be shy because Paola is really nice. I think you got that part. Like, she uses emojis while coding. So I think it's awesome. Okay. So I think it's time to, so there's one question. 2 questions. Someone would be interested to know if there has been some A/B testing done.
No, the only feedback that I have is about documentation. I can share again. So about documentation is this slide. So the project that we worked on had 1 year of life, and in 1 year the contribution were very few, or were distributed in time. And since we worked on the documentation, we saw this peak of a contribution. I was pretty surprised too. I'm very glad about that. And about readability of code, I can give you a feedback because in the project that I worked on at Dashlane 2 years ago, 1.5 years, I had the experience of onboarding one new member to the team each month. So it was a very heavy process. And if the code was not readable, if the documentation wasn't in place, I wouldn't have been able to survive because there was just no time to deliver features and to onboard people. And this is also the reason why we worked so much on the documentation, because we knew that there were people coming, and so we had to prepare the road for them.
Paola, there is another interesting question, which is how can we convince other people to code with empathy and adopt some of the practices you suggested tonight? Document code, write human readable code. And then the person added, meaning other people, your colleague who think comments and documentation are a waste of time.
Yeah, well, it all comes to the fact that the legacy code, like the legacy code that you write, will firstly impact yourself. And probably the exercise that you should ask them is to make them leave a piece of code for 1 month and come back to that. And if they left it unclean, make them come back to that and say if they are efficient working on that. Or you can try with an A/B test. So refactor a piece of code and use readable code in one piece of code, and then try which part of the code is more comfortable to work with. In my team, they are everybody's now very fan of this topic. And you can also share, talks about that. I can share more talks about the topic that are very convincing.
Good, thank you. And you have a lot of thank you for your presentation.